He asked for a wife at 40, and 3 women came from distant towns, with hope in their hearts and promises on their lips. But when they saw his face, when they saw the marks the fire had left, they all fled, until one arrived, and stayed. Can you imagine living 15 years waiting for someone to look at you without turning away in horror? Can you imagine asking for love, knowing that your own appearance is the first barrier? But this story happened in the interior of Wyoming in March 1903, when a man marked by fire decided to risk his heart one last time. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Write your city and state. It helps the channel grow and bring more emotional stories like this to you. And if you aren't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss any stories of resilience and true love. Now come with me, because this story will give you chills and warm your heart at the same time. Richard Albright woke up every day at 5 in the morning when the sun was just an orange promise on the horizon of the high plains. He woke up alone, as he had for 15 years, ever since that night in August 1888 that split his life into 2 distinct halves. The half before, when he was an ordinary 25-year-old man with a wife and 2 small children, and the half after, when he became the scarred man living isolated on a ranch 5 miles from the town of Stone Creek. He would rise from his simple cot, put on the thick cotton trousers and the long-sleeved shirt he wore even in the stifling heat of October. His bare feet touched the worn floorboards he had replaced himself 3 times over the years. The house was small, but well kept, with whitewashed log walls, a sturdy shingle roof with no leaks, and 3 rooms he kept clean with almost religious discipline. Not because he expected visitors. No one visited Richard Albright by choice, but because work, any work, kept his hands busy and his mind away from dark places. He would light the wood stove, brew strong coffee in an enameled iron pot, and cut 2 thick slices of the bread he baked every week. He ate in silence, sitting at the wooden table he had built with his own hands, looking out the open window at the yard, where the chickens were already scratching for the day's first insects. The ranch was prosperous. No one could deny that. 300 acres of good land, with green cornfields, a potato patch, a thriving vegetable garden, an apple orchard, 12 dairy cows, pigs, chickens, and 3 horses. Richard was a tireless worker, and the land repaid his effort with generosity. But material prosperity didn't warm the empty bed at night. It didn't fill the house with voices. It didn't put laughter in the walls. And at 40 years old, Richard Albright was fully aware that time was passing, taking with it the last chances of having someone by his side, of not dying alone in that house he had built after the fire. The scars covered the left side of his face, from his scalp down to his neck, descending along his entire shoulder and arm. The skin was a map of irregular mountains and valleys, red in some spots, white in others, shiny where the tissue had regenerated strangely. His left eye still saw miraculously, but the eyelid was a reconstructed piece of flesh that didn't close completely, giving him a permanent expression of surprise or shock on that side of his face. His left ear was just a small piece of irregular cartilage. His lips, pulled by the scarred skin, formed a crooked smile, even when he was serious. Richard knew exactly how people reacted upon seeing him. He knew the sequence. First, the gaze that fixed, then the widening of eyes in shock, followed by the quick look away trying to disguise it, and finally, the silent discomfort that filled the air like smoke. Some people felt fear, others pity, some poorly disguised disgust. All without exception were relieved when he walked away. That's why he lived in isolation. He went to town only once a month, always on the same day, always at the same early hour when fewer people walked the dirt streets. He bought the essentials: salt, sugar, kerosene, fabric, nails, tools. He paid in cash, spoke the bare minimum, loaded everything onto his horse, and returned to his ranch before noon. The shopkeepers treated him with tense politeness, accepted his money, thanked him for the purchase, and visibly relaxed when he walked out the door. Widow Higgins, who lived 3 miles away, was the only person who visited Richard with any regularity. She was 65, a widow for 20 years, and possessed that quiet wisdom of someone who has seen enough of life not to be frightened by appearances. She appeared every 2 weeks bringing fresh cheese, molasses, sometimes a jar of preserves, and stayed for half an hour talking about crops, the weather, and town news. She looked Richard in the eye when she spoke to him, both eyes without looking away, without wavering, and it was Widow Higgins who, in late March 1903, planted the idea that would germinate into a decision. She was sitting at his table, drinking coffee, when she asked casually if he hadn't thought about finding a companion. Richard had laughed, that bitter laugh that sounded more like a dry cough. "A companion," he repeated. "Who would want a man like me, Mrs. Higgins? You know very well how people look at me." The old lady had remained silent for a moment, stirring the sugar in her coffee, and then replied with a firm voice, "There are women out there in difficult situations, Richard. Widows alone, women without family, without resources, women who need a roof and a hard-working, honest man. Your appearance scares people, I won't lie. But your ranch is prosperous, you are a good man, you don't drink, don't gamble, don't fight. There are women who would accept that. There are women needing a chance too." The words echoed in Richard's head for weeks. He thought about them while ploughing the land, while milking the cows, while mending fences under the scorching sun. He thought about them at night, lying on his cot, looking at the wooden ceiling where the lantern light drew dancing shadows. Was it possible? Would any woman accept a marriage of convenience with him? Not love that he didn't expect anymore. Love was for whole men, for men who didn't make other people instinctively recoil. But perhaps companionship, perhaps someone to share the house, share the meals, share the weight of the days. In late April, Richard made the decision. On a Saturday morning, he put on his best clothes, the cotton trousers and shirt he reserved for rare occasions, put on his leather hat, mounted his bay horse, and went to town. But instead of doing his usual shopping, he went directly to the parish church, a simple building with white walls and a single tower that stood in the central square. He waited outside until the 7 o'clock Mass ended and the few faithful left, crossing themselves and talking quietly. Then he entered. Father August was putting away his vestments when Richard appeared in the sacristy. The priest was a man in his 50s, grey-haired, with a prominent belly and the soft hands of someone who had never worked the fields. But he had kind eyes and a sincere heart. He looked up, recognized Richard, and waved for him to enter. Richard took off his hat, held it between his hands, and for the first time in 15 years asked something of someone other than God. "Father August, I came to ask for your help with a delicate matter," Richard began, his voice coming out hoarser than usual. The priest indicated the chair beside the small table, sat down as well, and waited patiently. Richard took a deep breath. "I am 40 years old, Father. My ranch is prosperous. I have money saved, I have good land, a solid house. I'm hard-working and a man of my word. But I'm alone, and I'm tired of being alone." He paused, the words struggling to come out. "I would like you to help me find a wife." Father August showed no surprise. He just nodded slowly, clasping his hands on the table. "I understand, Richard. It is natural for a man to want companionship. But you know the difficulties your appearance might bring?" Richard let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "I know well, Father. I don't expect to find a pretty girl who falls in love with me, but I thought perhaps there is some woman in a difficult situation. A widow without resources, a woman alone, someone who needs a roof and a hard-working husband. It doesn't have to be for love. It can be for necessity. But it would be a real marriage, Father. I would treat her with respect and provide everything she needed. The priest remained silent for a long time, studying Richard's marked face. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll see what I can do. I have contact with priests in other parishes. I'll write some letters, ask some questions. But I promise nothing, Richard. You need to be prepared for rejection. Richard nodded. I've lived with rejection for 15 years, Father. I'm used to it. But I want to try. I just want to try once. The weeks that followed were of anxious expectation, mixed with deep skepticism. Richard told no one about the request he had made, not even Widow Higgins when she appeared with fresh molasses in early May. He continued his usual routine, waking early, working the land, tending the animals, eating alone, sleeping alone. But now there was a spark of something in his chest. It wasn't quite hope. Hope was too big a word. It was more like a cautious curiosity, a small what-if, that he didn't dare let grow. In late May, Richard returned to town for his monthly shopping. Father August found him at Mr. Oakley's general store and asked him to stop by the church before leaving. Richard felt his heart race but kept a neutral expression. He finished his shopping, tied the packages to the saddle, and walked to the church with measured steps. The priest was waiting for him with a letter in his hand. I have an answer, Richard, he said with a careful voice. A 35-year-old widow from Denver. She lost her husband 2 years ago, is living with her sister, but the sister has a large family and can't support her for much longer. The priest of the parish there said she is a serious, hard-working woman of good reputation. She is willing to consider marriage. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Does she know? About my face? The priest nodded. I wrote explaining your situation fully. She said she wants to meet you anyway. She arrives next week on Thursday, on the supply wagon that makes the route. If you both agree, you can marry right here. Richard returned home in a daze. He cleaned the entire house, scrubbed the floor until the boards shone, washed all the clothes, fixed the squeaky door, weeded the yard, painted the window frames with fresh lime. He didn't sleep properly all week. He mentally rehearsed what he would say, how he would behave, trying to predict all possibilities. On Thursday he put on clean clothes, saddled the horse, and arrived in town at 3 p.m, the agreed time. The supply wagon arrived at 4, kicking up a cloud of red dust on the main street. Richard waited outside the church with Father August by his side. He had kept his hat pulled low over his head, partially covering the left side of his face. A woman stepped down from the wagon. She was thin, short, wearing a patched brown dress and holding a small trunk as her only luggage. Brown hair pulled back in a tight bun, angular face, calloused hands. She looked around, spotted the priest, and started walking toward them. Richard removed his hat slowly, fully exposing the scars to the raw afternoon light. The woman stopped 10 feet away. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly. Richard saw the sequence he knew so well, shock, horror, disbelief. She brought her hand to her mouth, took a step back, then another. "I'm sorry," she murmured with a trembling voice. "I'm really sorry, but I can't do it." She turned and practically ran back to the wagon. The driver, embarrassed, took her trunk, helped her up and drove off, kicking up dust again. Richard put his hat back on slowly. Father August placed a hand on his shoulder but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Richard mounted his horse and returned home as the sun set, dyeing the sky orange and purple. That night, he didn't cry. He was beyond that. He just lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling until sleep came, heavy as stone. But Father August didn't give up. In late June, another letter came. A 38-year-old widow from Cheyenne. She arrived on a Tuesday in July with 2 worn dresses and hope in her eyes. It lasted 5 minutes, time enough for Richard to take off his hat, for her to see the scars under the sunlight, for the horror to settle in her expression. She said she needed to think, that she wasn't ready, that maybe later. She got on the wagon of the same driver who brought her and didn't look back. The third came in September. A 42-year-old woman from Laramie, also a widow, also desperate according to the priest who sent her. Richard almost didn't go to meet her. He was tired of the repeated humiliation, tired of seeing horror mirrored in women's eyes, tired of carrying hope that always ended crushed. But something inside him, some fundamental stubbornness, made him saddle the horse and go to town one more time. This one lasted longer. She stayed 10 whole minutes, talked to him, asked questions about the ranch, the house, what he expected from a wife. Richard answered with careful honesty, keeping his voice calm, explaining that he needed a companion, someone to share life with, that he would treat her with respect and provide everything she needed. The woman listened, nodded, seemed to consider it seriously. But then, when he asked if she would accept seeing the ranch, she looked at the scars again, swallowed hard, and said in a small voice that she couldn't, that it was too much for her, that she was sorry, but she couldn't wake up every day and see that. Richard thanked her politely, mounted his horse, and returned home under a light September rain that wet the earth and ran down the furrows of his destroyed face, mixing with sweat and something that might have been tears, but which he would not acknowledge as such. That night, sitting at the table with a half-eaten plate of beans and bread, he made the decision to stop, to try no more. It was too late for him. Some things simply weren't possible, and a man needed to accept his limits. He would live alone and die alone, and that was fine. It had to be. The next day he went to town for the last time on that matter. He found Father August sweeping the church steps and said with a firm voice that he appreciated the efforts, but he didn't want him to look for anyone else. "It doesn't work, Father. It's never going to work. Best I accept that now." The priest started to protest, but Richard raised a hand asking for silence. "I tried. It was enough. Now I'm going to live my life as it is." But Father August had one last name written in his notebook, one last letter that had arrived the previous week, from a priest in the town of Silverton. The priest mentioned a 32-year-old widow in a desperate situation with no close family, living on favors and small jobs, urgently needing a solution for her life. Her name was Clara Miller. Father August held Richard's arm before he walked away. "Just one more, Richard, please. This one is in a very difficult situation. If you don't at least agree to meet her, she has nowhere to go. Just one more. If it doesn't work out, I promise I won't look for anyone else." Richard looked at the priest, at his pleading eyes, and felt the anger melt into weariness. "Just one more," he agreed finally, "but it's the last one. I can't take this any more, Father." The letter was sent. The answer arrived in October. Clara Miller accepted coming to meet the suitor and, if there was an agreement, to marry immediately. She couldn't afford to make multiple trips. It was all or nothing. She would arrive on October 28th, a Friday, on the afternoon wagon. Richard didn't clean the house this time. He didn't weed the yard, didn't paint frames, didn't rehearse words. He went to town at the scheduled time wearing his normal work clothes, stained with red earth, with an old, worn leather hat. There was no more expectation, just the fulfillment of a promise made to the priest. It would be quick. She would see his face recoil like all the others, and it would be the end of it all. The wagon arrived at 5 in the afternoon, when the sun was already starting to set. Richard was leaning against the wall of the general store, hat on his head, arms crossed. Father August waited at the church door, wringing his hands anxiously. The driver stopped the wagon and helped a woman down. Clara Miller was shorter than Richard had imagined. She must have been just over 5 feet tall. Too thin, bones visible at her wrists and the base of her neck. Faded grey dress, with careful patches on the shoulders and hem. Dark brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. A face of delicate features, large dark eyes, thin lips. She carried a small bundle tied with string as her only luggage. She didn't even have a trunk. She looked around with that expression of someone arriving in unknown territory. The priest waved, and she walked toward him with measured steps, her posture strangely erect despite her thinness and worn clothes. Richard remained leaning against the wall, waiting. He was in no hurry. He knew exactly how this would end. Father August pointed in his direction. Clara turned her head, located Richard, and began to walk. Richard pushed off the wall slowly, straightened his posture. She approached, stopping 6 feet away. Richard took off his hat slowly, exposing the scars to the golden late-afternoon light. Clara looked. Her eyes traveled over the left side of his face, the irregular tissue, the shiny and deformed skin, the missing ear, the pulled lips. Richard waited for the horror, the shock, the inevitable recoil. But Clara just looked. Her eyes didn't widen. Her mouth didn't open in a silent scream. She looked at the scars like someone looks at an old tree or a large rock, with attention but without judgment. Then her eyes met his, both of them, and she asked in a low but firm voice, "Are you Richard Albright?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. Her voice was deeper than he expected, husky at the edges. "My name is Clara Miller," she continued. "I came from Silverton. Father Ambrose said you are looking for a wife, for a marriage of convenience. Is that true?" Richard finally found his voice. "It is true." She nodded slowly. "Then I accept. If you still want to, I accept marrying you." Richard blinked again. "Don't you want to see the ranch first? See the house? Think about it?" Clara shook her head. "I have nowhere to go back to," she said with raw honesty. "I have no family, no money, no home. Father Ambrose said you are a hard-working and honest man. He said you have good land and a solid house. He said you will treat me with respect. If that is true, then I accept. If you still want to, I stay." Richard looked at her, at that small, thin woman with eyes too big for her face, with a patched dress and a bundle tied with string, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't see horror in the eyes of someone looking at him. He didn't see pity either, only weariness, and a quiet determination that he recognized because it was equal to his own. "I still want to," he said, his voice coming out hoarse. "If you accept, we can marry right now. The priest is waiting." Clara nodded a single time. "Then let's get married." And so, in the parish church of Stone Creek, under the orange light of candles and the long shadows of an October afternoon, Richard Albright, 40 years old, with a face marked by fire, married Clara Miller, 32 years old, with eyes that didn't flinch. Father August conducted the short ceremony, his voice choked with emotion. There were no guests, just the driver waiting to leave, and Widow Higgins, who had appeared upon hearing the news and stood at the back of the church, smiling with tears in her eyes. When the priest pronounced them married, Richard and Clara looked at each other like polite strangers who had just made a business deal. There was no kiss, just a mutual nod of confirmation. Then Richard took her bundle, tied it to the saddle of the horse, helped her up, and the two set off toward the ranch as the sun set, dyeing the plains red and gold. Clara sat in front, holding the saddle horn. Richard sat behind, holding the reins, her body small and tense against his. Neither spoke during the 5-mile ride, only the sound of the horses' hooves on the dirt, the crickets starting to sing, and the soft October wind smelling of dry grass and wildflowers. When they arrived at the ranch and Clara saw the house, the corrals, the garden, she said nothing. Richard helped her down, showed her the room, left her bundle on the narrow bed, and said in a formal voice that she could rest, that he would prepare something for dinner. Clara just nodded, and thus began the most unlikely marriage in Stone Creek, between a man rejected by 3 women and a woman who stayed because she had nowhere to run. The first days were of polite silence and careful distance. Richard woke up before dawn as always, made coffee, set the table, and went out to work in the fields before Clara woke up. She got up when the sun was already high, found the hot coffee on the stove, fresh bread on the table, and the house empty. She spent the day exploring the space that was now her home, organizing the few belongings she had brought, trying to understand the routine of that place and that strange man who was her husband. The house had 3 rooms, a main room that also served as a kitchen with a wood stove, wooden table, 2 chairs, an old trunk, and shelves on the wall with pots and supplies. A small bedroom where Richard slept, with the cot, a rough wardrobe, and a window overlooking the orchard. And another, even smaller room, which he used to store tools and sacks of grain, but which he had cleaned out and put a narrow bed in for Clara. Separate rooms. He had made that clear from the start, with that tense formality he used for everything. Clara didn't know if she felt relief or something like disappointment because of the separate rooms. Not that she wanted intimacy with a stranger, but separate rooms made it clear that this was an arrangement, not a real marriage. It was a roof over her head in exchange for domestic work, nothing more. And she accepted that. She had to accept it. She had no choice, and choice was a luxury women like her couldn't afford. During the day, while Richard worked in the fields, Clara took over the household chores with quiet efficiency. She swept the floorboards, washed clothes in the stone tank near the well, hung them on the makeshift line between 2 trees. She cooked beans, potatoes, prepared the flour, baked bread. The pantry was well stocked, full of supplies Richard had accumulated over the months. There was lard, salt, brown sugar, coffee, cornmeal, plenty of beans. In the garden, she found pumpkins, okra, tomatoes, peppers, kale. In the coop, fresh eggs. She worked methodically without rushing, learning where everything was kept, creating order in the space. Richard returned at noon for lunch. He always took off his boots at the door, washed his hands and face in the bucket outside, and entered with heavy steps. He sat at the table where Clara had already set the food. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Richard thanked her for the food in a low voice. Clara nodded in response, and he went out again to continue working until sunset. At night, they ate the same silent meal. Then Richard went to the yard to smoke a straw cigarette, looking at the stars, and Clara washed the dishes, tidied the kitchen, and retired to her room. Through the thin walls, she heard the sounds of him getting ready to sleep. Boots being pulled off and placed on the floor, the creak of the cot when he lay down, the long sigh before the silence of the night. A week passed like this. Then 2. They were 2 people living in the same house, but in separate worlds, orbiting around each other without ever touching, without ever really talking beyond what was strictly necessary. Clara cooked, cleaned, tended the chickens, gathered eggs, watered the garden. Richard worked the land, mended fences, tended the cattle, brought firewood, hunted when necessary. A functional partnership, nothing more. But small things began to change, so subtle that neither of them noticed consciously at first. In the 3rd week, Clara noticed that Richard liked his coffee strong, almost bitter, and started making it the way he preferred without him asking. Richard noticed that she always left a piece of bread to eat in the afternoon and started baking 2 loaves instead of 1, so there would be enough. Clara noticed his shirt had a tear on the shoulder, took the shirt when he was bathing in the creek, mended the tear with small, careful stitches, and returned it without saying anything. Richard saw that the bucket she used to draw water from the well had a loose handle, fixed it one night after dinner, and put it back in place without comment. Small gestures, silent, but gestures that said, "I see you. I notice what you need." It was Widow Higgins who broke part of the silence between them. She appeared one afternoon in November, bringing fresh molasses and immense curiosity about Richard's new wife. Clara was hanging clothes on the line when she saw the elderly woman arrive, riding a gentle mule, waving enthusiastically. Widow Higgins dismounted with surprising agility for her age, tied the mule in the shade, and walked straight to Clara with a wide smile. "You must be Clara," she said bluntly. "I'm Widow Higgins, neighbor from down the way. I came to meet you and bring molasses." Clara accepted the clay pot, thanked her in a low voice, and offered coffee. The two sat at the table, and for the first time since arriving, Clara talked to someone for real. Widow Higgins talked non-stop, telling stories of the region, asking questions about Silverton, commenting on the weather and the crops. And then, with that frankness only old people have the right to use, she asked how it was living with Richard. Clara held the coffee cup between her hands, feeling the warmth in the porcelain, and answered with careful honesty, "He is a good man, hard-working, treats me with respect. I have no complaints." Widow Higgins nodded slowly, studying the young woman's face. "But do you talk?" Clara hesitated. "Little. He's not much for talking." Widow Higgins laughed, a sharp, joyful sound. "A man who lives alone for 15 years forgets how to talk, my dear. You'll have to start the conversation. He won't do it alone. He's used to too much silence." When Richard returned for lunch and found Widow Higgins sitting at the table, his face lit up in a way Clara had never seen. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, with something that was almost a smile on that scarred face. "Good to see you." The old lady patted the chair next to her. "Sit here, Rick. I came to meet your wife. She's pretty and hard-working. You got lucky." Richard looked at Clara quickly, then looked away. "I know," he murmured. During lunch, Widow Higgins commanded the conversation, asking questions, telling stories, forcing Richard and Clara to participate. And it was there, eating beans and rice and listening to Widow Higgins talk about the last social in town, that Clara heard Richard laugh for the first time. It was a brief sound, almost swallowed, but it was laughter. And when she looked at him, she saw that the right side of his face, the whole side, was handsome when he relaxed like that. Light brown eyes, expression lines around them, strong jaw. She looked away quickly when she realized she was staring. After Widow Higgins left, promising to return in 2 weeks, the house seemed more silent than ever. Richard was in the yard fixing a harness when Clara went out to throw away dirty water. She hesitated, remembering Widow Higgins' words, and then spoke before her courage fled. "Richard?" He looked up, surprised that she initiated conversation. "Need something?" Clara shook her head. "I just wanted to know—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Mrs. Higgins said you've lived here for 15 years. Were you always alone?" Richard stood still for a moment. Then he went back to working on the harness, but answered in a low voice. "Not always. I had a family before, wife, 2 children. Clara waited, but he didn't continue. She almost gave up, almost went back inside, but something made her insist. "What happened?" Richard pulled the leather strap with unnecessary force. "Fire," he said finally. "August of 1888. Our house caught fire in the middle of the night. I tried to get them out, managed to grab my oldest son, threw him out the window. But when I went back to get my wife and little son, the roof collapsed." He paused, his voice getting hoarser. "They died. I survived with this here." He gestured vaguely to his scarred face. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "I'm so sorry," she said, and the words were inadequate, too small for the pain he had described. Richard shrugged, but the gesture was tense. It was a long time ago. He didn't look at her, just kept working on the harness, but he had told her. He had shared. It was a start. That night Clara made chicken stew, a dish that required time and care. When Richard sat down for dinner and tasted the first spoonful, he stopped, looked at the plate, then at her. "This is very good," he said. "My mother used to make it like this." Clara felt something warm spread through her chest. It was a small compliment, but coming from him it seemed huge. Days went by, and slowly, very slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. It wasn't love. Neither was ready for that, or maybe didn't know how to love anymore, but it was something, mutual recognition. Two lonely people sharing the same space, starting to realize that maybe they didn't need to be so lonely after all. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next emotional stories. Richard started coming home a little earlier, inventing excuses to pass by the yard where Clara worked in the garden. She started lingering in the kitchen at night, knowing he smoked in the yard and sometimes had to come in for water or more tobacco. They talked in short fragments about the weather, the garden, the animals, small plans for the farm. Nothing deep, but they talked. One night in December, when the heat was unbearable, Clara couldn't sleep. She got up, went to the kitchen to get water, and found Richard sitting at the table in the dark, only moonlight coming through the window. He couldn't sleep either. They stayed there, sitting opposite each other in the silvery gloom, drinking cool water from the clay pot, and for the first time, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost companionable. Richard broke the silence with a low voice. "Why did you accept? Marrying me? You could have tried something else, a job, anything." Clara turned the mug in her hands. "There was nothing else," she said simply. "My husband died leaving me with debts I didn't know existed. I lost the house, lost everything. I was living on charity, doing jobs that paid almost nothing. It was ending. When Father Ambrose told me about you, he said you were a good man, just had bad luck with looks." She paused. "I had bad luck with many things too. Thought we could have bad luck together." Richard let out something between a laugh and a sigh. "Bad luck together. That's one way to see it." Clara looked at him through the shadows. "You don't have bad luck, Richard. You have a prosperous farm, you're hard-working, a good man. You just have marks on your face. That's not bad luck. That's just appearance." Richard remained silent for a long time. "You're the first person who looks at me and doesn't flinch," he said finally, voice loaded with something that sounded like wonder. "Even children recoil when they see me. But you didn't flinch once." Clara held the mug tighter. "I've seen worse than scars," she said softly. "I've seen a man with a handsome face and a rotten heart. I lived with one. I prefer a man with a marked face and a good heart 1,000 times over." Richard raised his eyes to her, and even in the dim light, Clara saw the intensity in that gaze. "Your husband. Did he beat you?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded once, a short, dry movement. "He did. Drank and hit. For 4 years, until the day he drank too much, fell off his horse coming back from the store and broke his neck. Everyone in town said I should be sad. I pretended I was, but the truth is, when he died, I breathed for the first time in years." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Richard didn't say he was sorry, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded slowly and said with a firm voice, "I will never lay a hand on you like that. You can rest easy about that." Clara looked at him, at that big man with half his face destroyed and eyes that didn't lie, and for the first time since arriving, felt something like safety. "I know," she said. "I trust that." After that night, something definitely changed between them. It wasn't just polite respect anymore. It was something deeper, mutual knowledge, recognition of shared pain. They started working together in the garden, Richard hoeing while Clara planted, the two side by side under the strong December sun. He taught her how to milk the cows, his large hands guiding hers in the right movements, and when their hands touched, neither pulled away immediately. She began tending to his old wounds when she saw he was in pain from the scars due to sun or heavy work, applying herbal compresses that Widow Higgins had taught her, and Richard let her. staying still while she ran gentle fingers over the scarred skin. Small moments that warmed the heart, glances that lingered, shy smiles, words spoken softly, hands touching during work and not separating as quickly as they should. Richard started sitting at the table longer after dinner, just to talk to her while she washed dishes. Clara started going out to the yard at night, staying close to him while he smoked, looking at the same stars, sharing the same comfortable silence. One night he told her about the children he lost, their names, their ages, the things they liked to do. He cried while speaking, tears running down the scarred side of his face, and Clara held his hand without saying anything, just holding on. Another night, she told him about the years of bad marriage, the constant fear, the shame of not being able to leave, and Richard listened without interrupting, then said she was the strongest woman he knew, and she believed him because she saw sincerity in his eyes. In January, during a violent summer storm, lightning struck near the house, thunder echoing like an explosion. Clara, lying in her room, felt terror rise in her throat, a visceral memory of bad nights when thunder meant her husband was coming home drunk. She curled up in bed, trembling, and didn't notice when Richard appeared in the doorway, awakened by the same thunder. He saw her huddled, heard the low sobs, and without thinking entered. "Clara," he called softly. She lifted her face, eyes wide. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to comfort. "It's just a storm," he said, with a soothing voice. "Nothing bad will happen. I am here. You are safe." Clara straightened up slowly, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "Sorry," she murmured. "I know it's silly, but thunder reminds me." Richard shook his head. "It's not silly. Fear is never silly." They stayed there, sitting on the edge of her bed, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the distant thunder, and gradually Clara stopped shaking. When the storm passed, Richard stood up to leave, but she held his shirt sleeve. "Richard?" He stopped, looked at her. "Thank you for being here." He nodded, something passing over his marked face that looked like tenderness. "I'll always be," he said. "As long as you want, I'll be here." After he left, Clara lay down again, but this time she didn't feel fear. She felt something different, something warm and unfamiliar that took her a moment to identify. Hope. Hope that perhaps that convenient arrangement could become something real, something good. Months passed, and what began as a marriage of convenience was transforming into a true partnership, companionship, something that maybe, just maybe, could be called love one day. They still slept in separate rooms, but the doors stayed open now. They still maintained a certain formality, but it was a gentle formality, full of small kindnesses. Richard brought wildflowers from the pasture and left them on the table without a word. Clara sewed new clothes for him with fabric he bought in town. They worked side by side, ate together, talked at night, and slowly were building something neither knew was still possible. A shared life. A life that wasn't perfect, but was theirs. It was in March 1904, almost 5 months after Clara arrived, that Widow Higgins appeared with news that would bring a different kind of storm. She arrived mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, looking worried. Richard was fixing the chicken coop. Clara was washing clothes, and both stopped upon seeing the urgency in the old lady's gestures. She dismounted the mule quickly, beckoned them closer. "I need to tell you something," she said bluntly. "There's a man in town asking questions about a woman named Clara. Described her perfectly, said he's her brother-in-law, needs to speak to her about urgent family matters. He's asking around the market, the church, trying to find if anyone knows her." Clara felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her face lost all color. Richard noticed immediately, dropped the hammer, and walked to her. "Who is it?" Clara swallowed hard, voice trembling. "Darryl. He's my late husband's brother." Richard looked at Widow Higgins. What else did he say? The old lady pursed her lips. Said his sister-in-law inherited family debts, that she needs to settle accounts, that it's her obligation. He's saying if she doesn't show up, he'll find her and drag her back to Silverton, making veiled threats. Richard felt anger start to boil in his chest, a cold, calculated anger he hadn't felt in years, looked at Clara, saw the fear in her eyes, saw her hands shaking. Placed his large hand firmly on her shoulder. "He won't touch you," he said with a voice that allowed no argument. "You are my wife. You are under my protection. He won't get close." Clara looked at him, eyes full of tears she refused to let fall. "He won't give up, Richard. Darrell is a stubborn and violent man. If he finds out I'm here—" Richard squeezed her shoulder gently. "Then we don't let him find out. And if he does, we solve it. Together." Widow Higgins nodded approvingly. "No one in town knows you married Clara, Richard. You don't go out, don't talk to people. She came straight here, no one saw. As long as you stay on the farm, he won't find out." Richard agreed, but worry was stamped on his marked face. "How long did he say he's staying in town?" Widow Higgins grimaced. "Didn't say, but he's staying at Mrs. Margaret's boarding house. Seems willing to stay as long as needed." After Widow Higgins left, promising to alert them of any news, Richard and Clara stood in the yard in tense silence. Clara was pale, arms crossed over her body, as if cold despite the March heat. Richard watched her, seeing the fear she tried to hide, and felt something fierce wake up inside him, something protective and possessive that had been dormant for a long time. "Tell me," he said finally, "about the debts, about Darrell. I need to know what we're facing." Clara took a deep breath, then began to speak. "When my husband died, debts appeared that I didn't know about. Money he owed to loan sharks, shop owners, everyone. I couldn't pay. Lost the rented house, was left with nothing. Darrell appeared saying he'd help, but his help had a price." She paused, voice lowering. "He wanted me to marry him. Said the brother's debt stayed in the family, that I was his obligation now. But I knew what he was. He's worse than his brother. Much worse. When I refused, he said I'd pay the debts one way or another, kept making threats, showing up where I worked, saying he'd make me pay with my body what I couldn't pay with money." Richard felt the anger rise, burning cold and intense. "That's why you ran. Why you accepted marrying me." Clara nodded, tears finally running down her face. "I thought if I came far away, if I married, he'd give up. Forget me." But he didn't forget. She looked at Richard with desperation in her eyes. "I shouldn't have come. Shouldn't have brought this trouble to you. I'm sorry, truly sorry." Richard took 2 steps and pulled her close, hugging her for the first time since they married. She went rigid for a second, then melted against his chest, crying softly. "You brought no trouble," Richard said firmly, mouth close to her head. "You came here because you needed to, and I married you because I wanted to. And now you are my wife, Clara, my real wife. And no one will take you from here, no one will make you afraid. I promise you that." Clara held his shirt tightly, face pressed against his broad chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady. She believed him. Believed because in the last 5 months, Richard had proven to be a man of his word, a man of honor, a man who protected what was his, and she was his now, for better or worse. They stood there embraced while the sun went down, dyeing the sky orange and red, 2 people marked by life who had finally found safe harbor in each other. But danger was in town, asking questions, searching, and both knew the storm was just beginning. That night, Richard didn't let Clara sleep alone, not for intimacy, but for protection. He dragged his cot into her room, positioned it near the door, and lay down fully dressed with the shotgun beside him. "If Darrell finds out and comes here, he'll have to go through me," he said, "and I won't let him." Clara, lying in her bed, looked at him through the darkness. "You don't have to do this." Richard turned his head toward her. "Yes, I do. You are my family now, Clara. You're all I have, and I protect what's mine." The words hung in the dark air, heavy with promise and meaning. Clara felt something warm up inside her chest, something beyond gratitude or relief. It was deeper, scarier. It was the beginning of love. True love, the kind she thought she'd never feel, the kind that didn't depend on a handsome face or flowery words, but on firm actions and a loyal heart. "Richard," she called softly. He waited. "Thank you for everything, for accepting me, for protecting me, for being you." Richard remained silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice came out hoarse with emotion. "I thank you for staying, for not running, for seeing me. No one has ever seen me like you do." They said nothing more that night, just slept in the same room, one protecting the other, two hearts starting to beat in the same rhythm. And outside, in the stars of the plains, destiny was preparing the confrontation that would define if that budding love could survive. 2 days later, Widow Higgins returned. This time the news was worse. Darryl had found out. Someone in town, a woman who shopped at the same store as Widow Higgins, had heard the old lady comment about Richard's new wife, had pieced it together, commented to others, and the news reached Darryl's ears. He now knew where Clara was, and was planning to go to the ranch to get what he considered his right. Richard received the news with cold calm, thanked Widow Higgins, asked her to stay away for the next few days to avoid getting involved, and began to prepare. Locked the house, prepared the shotgun, positioned a knife at his waist. Clara watched with a tight heart. "You don't need to do this," she tried one more time. "I can run again. Go somewhere else." Richard looked at her firmly. "You won't run anymore. Running is over. We'll face this together, and he'll understand you aren't alone anymore." The next morning, Darryl Medeiros arrived. He came riding a black horse, bringing another man with him, both with hard, arrogant expressions. Stopped in the ranch yard, looked around, evaluating, and shouted for the owner of the house. Richard walked out slowly, shotgun in hand, hat pulled low. Clara stayed inside, but watching through the window, hands gripping the frame until her knuckles turned white. Darryl was a tall, strong man, about 35, with a thick mustache and small, cruel eyes. He looked at Richard, saw the shotgun, and smiled a humorless smile. "You must be the farmer who married my sister-in-law," he said with a drawling voice. "I came to get what's mine." Richard didn't move. "Clara is my wife. Married me of her own free will. There's nothing of yours here." Darryl spat on the ground. "She has a debt with me, family debt, $300 my brother owed and she inherited. Either she pays or she comes back with me to Silverton to settle accounts however I decide." Richard felt the anger boil, but kept his voice steady. "How much was the original debt?" Darryl hesitated. $150. Richard nodded slowly. "So it doubled in 6 months? Curious." Darryl turned red. "There's interest, adjustments." Richard took a step forward, shotgun still pointed. "Here is what's going to happen. You're going to turn around, go back to Silverton, and forget Clara exists. She is under my protection now. She's my legal wife, married in the church, paper registered. Any threat to her is a threat to me, and I won't accept it." Darryl laughed, but it was a dangerous laugh. "Look at that! The burned monster wants to play hero. Listen here, cripple. You don't scare me. No one respects you. You're a joke in town, the scarred man no one looks in the face. Do you think anyone will back you against me?" Darryl's companion laughed too, hand resting on the knife handle at his waist. "We're taking the woman, and you won't do anything, because if you do, we come back with more people and burn this little ranch, just like they burned your face." That was when something broke inside Richard. Not the threat to him, Threats to him he'd endured for 15 years. It was the threat to Clara. It was the idea of this violent man putting hands on the woman who had finally seen him, who had finally stayed, who had finally given him a reason to live again. Richard raised the shotgun with a quick movement, aimed straight at Daryl's chest. "Get off my land," he said with a voice that was pure steel. "Leave now, or I guarantee you won't return to Silverton in one piece." Daryl backed the horse, surprise mixed with anger on his face. His companion moved his hand to his knife, but stopped when Richard swung the shotgun toward him. The two men looked at each other. "This isn't over," Daryl spat. "I'll be back. And when I return, you'll wish you had given her to me when I asked politely." They turned the horses and galloped away, kicking up red dust. Richard stood still, shotgun still raised, until they disappeared down the road. Only then did he lower the weapon and realized he was shaking, not from fear, from pure rage and adrenaline. Clara ran out of the house, threw herself into his arms, trembling too. "He threatened you. He talked about burning the farm. Richard, this is dangerous. We need to do something." Richard hugged her tightly. "We will, but not the way he expects. Tomorrow I go to town. I'll talk to the sheriff, the judge, whoever I need to. I'll make it public that you are my wife, that you are under my protection, and that any threat to you will be treated as a crime. He'll have to face me legally, and I won't back down." Clara looked at him, at that man 3 women had rejected, who lived hidden from the world, and saw the courage that had always been there but no one had given a reason to awaken. "You're going out? In front of people? Even knowing how they'll look?" Richard held her face between his large, marked hands. "For you, I face anything. Any look, any word, any danger. You stayed when everyone ran. You saw me when no one did. Now it's my turn to fight for you. And I will fight, Clara. I will fight to the end." And there, in the farmyard under the March sun, Richard Albright kissed Clara Miller for the first time. It was a careful kiss, almost shy, but loaded with promise and meaning. And when they separated, both knew the marriage of convenience was dead. In its place, something much bigger was born, true love, forged in the fire of difficulties, tempered by mutual acceptance, and strong enough to weather any storm that came. The next morning, Richard woke up before sunrise, but this time not to work the fields. It was to prepare for something he hadn't done in 15 years, face the world with his head held high. He bathed in the creek, scrubbed his skin carefully, put on his best clothes, the white cotton shirt Clara had sewn for him, and the dark trousers he kept for rare occasions. He combed his hair on the right side, but didn't try to hide the scarred left side. Not anymore. Clara watched him from the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, fear evident in her dark eyes. She hadn't slept all night, tormented by worry about what Daryl might do, about the danger she had brought into the life of this good man who deserved no more suffering. Richard approached her, placed his large hands firmly on her shoulders. "I'll be back before noon," he said calmly. "Lock the house. Don't open for anyone except me or Widow Higgins. If any stranger appears, grab the shotgun and fire into the air to scare them. I'm leaving it loaded near the window." Clara held his wrist. "What if Daryl does something to you? What if people don't support you?" Richard smiled, that crooked smile the scars forced, but that now carried true tenderness. "Then I come back alone, but I come back. And we find another way, but I have to try, Clara. I need to show him you aren't alone, that someone is willing to face anything for you." She nodded, eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. "I know. Just come back soon." Richard tilted his head, kissed her forehead carefully, then mounted the bay horse and set off toward town as the sun began to paint the horizon gold and pink. The 5-mile journey never seemed so long. Richard rode at a steady pace, posture erect in the saddle, hat positioned so it didn't hide his face. Every time he passed someone on the road, a drover, a cowboy, a family going to the fields, He nodded in greeting. Some responded with surprise. Others looked away quickly, but Richard didn't lower his head. Not anymore. He had spent 15 years hiding, 15 years believing his appearance made him unworthy of living fully. But Clara had stayed. Clara had looked at his scars and seen the man beneath. If she could see, then maybe others could too. And even if they couldn't, he didn't care anymore, because he had something to fight for now, someone to protect. He arrived in Stone Creek at 8 in the morning. The central square was already busy with people buying at the markets, talking on the sidewalks, children running between wagons. Richard tied his horse in front of the sheriff's office, a small building with whitewashed walls and a heavy wooden door. Took a deep breath, removed his hat completely, and entered. Sheriff Amos Sullivan was sitting behind a desk full of papers, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He was a man in his 50s, paunchy, with a grey moustache and tired eyes of someone who has seen too much. He looked up when Richard entered and did that familiar sequence. Fixed stare, widening eyes, quick look away. But Richard didn't retreat. He stood in front of the desk, holding his hat between his hands, and waited. Sheriff Sullivan cleared his throat, composing himself. "Richard Albright, isn't it? Haven't seen you around here in a long time." Richard nodded. "A long time, Sheriff. But I came today because I need help. I came to file a report and ask for protection for my wife." The sheriff blinked in surprise. "Wife? I didn't even know you were married." Richard felt a pang of something bitter, because of course no one knew. No one paid enough attention to him to know. Married 5 months ago, to a widow from Silverton named Clara Miller. Paper registered, church wedding, all legal. The sheriff grabbed pen and paper, started writing. "And what's the problem?" Richard told everything. About Clara's brother-in-law, Darrell Medeiros, who appeared claiming false debts, making threats, saying he'd take Clara by force if necessary. About the visit to the ranch the previous day, the threats of violence, the attempted intimidation. About how Clara fled Silverton precisely to escape this man. The sheriff wrote, face growing serious. "And do you have proof of these threats?" Richard shook his head. "Just witness. Widow Higgins, my neighbor, she heard part of it and warned us he was looking. And yesterday he came to my ranch with another man, both armed, talking about burning me like my face was burned, talking about taking my wife by force." The sheriff sighed, putting the pen aside. "Look, Richard, verbal threats are hard to prove. And debt collection, even if exaggerated, isn't a crime in itself. Unless he actually tries something violent, there's not much I can do besides give a warning." Richard felt frustration burn in his chest. "So, you're saying I need to wait for him to do something to my wife before I can protect her?" The sheriff raised hands in a calming gesture. "Not that. I can call this Darrell here, give an official warning, make it clear any violence will have consequences. But I need you to understand I can't arrest anyone just for verbal threats." Richard stood silent for a moment, controlling his anger. "Then do that, Sheriff. Call him here and make it clear my wife is under the law's protection. And make it clear, too, that I am willing to defend her with all necessary means. If he comes on my property again, making threats, I'll consider it trespassing and will defend myself." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll send for him today. But Richard, try not to escalate this. Violence only brings more violence." Richard put his hat back on. "I don't want violence, Sheriff. I just want peace. But I won't let anyone hurt my wife. That I guarantee." He left the station feeling frustration mixed with determination, knew the law was limited, that words on paper had little power against men like Darrell. But he had taken the first step, made the situation official. Now he needed the second step. Make it public that Clara was his wife, so the community knew, so there were witnesses, so Darrell couldn't simply take her without consequences. He walked across the square toward the church. People stopped to look, whispered among themselves, pointed discreetly. Richard felt the looks like pins on his skin, but kept his head high. Entered the church where Father August was lighting candles for the 9 o'clock Mass. The priest turned, saw Richard, and his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Richard, good to see you, my son. How is Clara?" Richard took a deep breath. "She's fine, Father, but we have a problem, and I need your help." He told everything to the priest, who listened with increasingly worried expression. When Richard finished, Father August clasped his hands in silent prayer, then nodded firmly. "I will make the announcement at today's Mass. I will tell the whole congregation that you and Clara are married, that she is under the protection of the church and community. I will ask people to be vigilant and report any attempt at violence. Will that help?" Richard felt relief wash over him. "It will help a lot, Father. Thank you." The priest placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You are a good man, Richard. Always were. It gladdens me to see you fighting for someone. Gladdens me to see you living again." Richard left the church and went to the general market, bought supplies, talked to the store owner, Mr. Oakley, and for the first time in 15 years mentioned casually that he needed more flour because he had a wife at home now. Mr. Oakley, surprised but polite, congratulated him and asked her name. Richard answered loud enough for others to hear. "Clara Miller, now Clara Albright, married 5 months ago. Hard-working, good woman." People around heard, assimilated, and the news began to spread through the village like fire in dry grass. It was on the way back, passing in front of Mrs. Margaret's boarding house, that Richard saw Darrell. The man was on the porch, talking to 2 other shady-looking fellows, the 3 laughing loudly and drinking whiskey even though it was only 10 in the morning. Darrell saw Richard, and his laughter died. He stood up slowly, walked down the porch steps, and walked to the street, blocking the way. "Look who showed up in town," Darrell said with a voice slurred by drink. "The monster left his den." Richard stopped the horse, looked at him with a neutral expression. "I came to do what needed doing. Went to the sheriff, filed a formal complaint of your threats. Sheriff will call you for a warning, and went to church, where the priest will announce today at Mass that Clara is my lawful wife. Everyone will know, everyone will be watching, so if you try anything there will be consequences." Darrell spat on the ground, eyes red with anger and alcohol. "You think I'm scared of a sheriff or a priest? You think registered paper means anything? That woman is mine. Her brother owed me, she owes me, and I'm going to take what's mine, even if I have to burn your farm with you inside." The 2 men on the porch came down too, standing behind Darrell in a threatening posture. Richard felt fear try to settle in, but pushed it down. "You're making threats in front of witnesses, Darrell, on the main street of town, in the middle of the day. That's stupid." He looked around, saw several people had stopped to watch, were listening to everything. Darrell noticed too, and his expression became more dangerous. "I don't care about witnesses. Don't care about anything. This story ends my way. You can be sure." He took a threatening step toward the horse. Richard didn't retreat, sat in the saddle, looking down at Darrell, and said with a voice that echoed through the silent street, "If you lay a finger on my wife, if you step on my property again, if you try anything, I swear by everything holy, you will regret it. I lost my family once to fire. I won't lose again, and this time I fight. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the thrilling ending of this story." The silence that followed was tense, charged. People around watched, waiting to see who would back down first. It was Darrell who finally turned, spitting curses, and went back to the boarding house with his cronies. Richard waited until they disappeared inside, then continued his way. But his hands shook, holding the reins, and his heart beat too fast. Not from fear exactly. It was adrenaline, controlled rage. The awareness that he had just done something he never imagined doing. He had publicly confronted, in front of the whole community, another man, without hiding, without lowering his head, without shame of his scarred face. He returned to the ranch, finding Clara in the yard, shotgun in hand, face pale with worry. When she saw him, she dropped the weapon and ran, throwing herself into his arms as soon as he dismounted. "You took so long," she said with a trembling voice. "I thought something had happened." Richard hugged her tightly, feeling her small body shaking against his. "It's okay. Did what I needed. Went to the station, church, market. Everyone knows now you're my wife, and Darryl knows too. I won't let him near you." Clara pulled back a little, looking at his face. "You talked to him?" Richard nodded. "We had a confrontation in the street, in front of everyone. He made threats. I made it clear I'll defend myself." Clara brought her hand to her mouth. "Richard, that's dangerous. He won't give up now. It'll get worse." Richard held her face between his hands. "Let it get worse. I won't hide anymore, Clara. I spent 15 years hiding, ashamed, thinking I didn't deserve to live normally. But you showed me I do, that my appearance doesn't define who I am. So now I fight. I fight for you, for us, for the life we're building. And I don't care what Darryl or anyone else thinks." Clara looked at him, and something passed over her face that was a mix of fear, pride, and love. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. Richard shook his head. "You deserve everything. Deserve to be protected, deserve to be loved, deserve peace, and I'll give that to you. Or die trying." Clara held his scarred face, fingers gently tracing the marks she already knew so well. "I love you," she said, the words coming out for the first time raw and true. "I really love you, Richard. Not for convenience, not for necessity. I love you because you are the bravest and best man I've ever known." Richard felt something break inside his chest, but it was a good break, like ice melting and freeing water. No one had ever said those words to him, not before the fire, when he had a whole face, not after, when only scars remained. But Clara said it now, looking at him with eyes that didn't lie, touching his destroyed face with hands that didn't recoil. "I love you too," he replied, voice hoarse with emotion. "Loved you since the day you didn't run, since the moment you looked at me and stayed." They kissed there, in the farmyard under the hot March sun, and it was a different kiss from the first. It was a kiss of true love, real commitment, of two hearts that had found each other through pain and were determined to stay together. When they separated, Richard took her hand and led her inside the house. "Tonight," he said, "we sleep in the same room, as real husband and wife if you want." Clara smiled, and it was the first real smile he saw on her, the one that lit up her whole face. "I want to," she replied. "I want everything with you." The next 3 days were of constant tension. Richard didn't leave the farm, worked near the house, always with the shotgun within reach. Clara continued household chores, but also stayed alert, looking out the window frequently, expecting trouble. Widow Higgins appeared on the second day, bringing news. The sheriff had called Darryl and given an official warning, but Darryl laughed in his face, said he wasn't afraid of any law, that he'd solve it his way. The priest had made the announcement at Mass, and the whole congregation knew about the marriage. Lots of people talked, some with genuine curiosity, others with malicious gossip, but everyone knew. The information was public. On the night of the third day, the attack came. Richard and Clara were lying together in his room, which was now theirs, when the dogs began barking furiously outside. Richard sat up in bed immediately, all instincts alert. "Stay here," he said to Clara, grabbing the shotgun. She held his arm. "Don't go alone, let's go together." He wanted to protest, but saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. The two went out of the house, Richard in front with the shotgun, Clara behind with the kitchen knife. There were 3 men in the yard, Darryl and his 2 cronies, all armed with knives, machetes, clearly drunk. "Came to end this," shouted Darrell, voice slurred. "You didn't want to listen, now you'll learn the hard way." Richard raised the shotgun, aiming. "You are trespassing on private property. You are armed, making threats. There are 3 witnesses against you now if something happens. Leave while you can." Darrell laughed, that drunk, dangerous laugh. "Witness? What witness? Just you monster, and your slut wife." That was when Widow Higgins' voice echoed from the darkness. "There's me, too." But the old lady appeared mounted on the mule, holding a lantern. "I saw everything. Saw you invading Richard's property, making threats, and I'm not alone." 2 other figures emerged from the dark. Father August and Mr. Oakley from the market, both holding lanterns too. The priest took a step forward, brave despite the danger. "Darrell Medeiros, you are committing a crime. Trespassing, threat, attempted violence. There are 4 witnesses here and more people waiting on the road. The sheriff has been called. If you don't leave now, you're going to jail." Darrell looked around, saw he was outnumbered, that he had been discovered, that the situation had spun out of control. Rage and frustration distorted his face, but he wasn't stupid enough to attack with so many witnesses. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing at Richard and Clara. "This never ends." But his cronies were already retreating, nervous with the presence of the priest and witnesses. One of them pulled Darrell by the arm. "Let's go, man, this went wrong, let's go." Darrell resisted for a moment longer, then spat on the ground, turned and left, the 3 disappearing into the darkness. Richard lowered the shotgun slowly, whole body trembling with adrenaline and relief. Clara dropped the knife and leaned on him, legs almost giving way. Widow Higgins dismounted with Father August's help and walked to them. "Are you okay?" Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "How did you know?" It was Widow Higgins who answered, with that sharp smile of hers. "I knew he'd try something. Man like that doesn't give up easy. So I asked the priest and Mr. Oakley to keep watch with me, waiting on the road. When we saw them pass toward the farm, armed and drunk, we came after, and sent Joe to get the sheriff." Mr. Oakley waved at them. "Richard, you're a good customer, always were. Honest man, hard-working. Wasn't going to let these hooligans hurt you and your lady." Father August placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "And you are a son of this parish, Richard. Even living isolated, you are always part of this community. We look after our own." Richard felt emotion rise in his throat, so strong he could barely breathe. For 15 years he lived thinking he was rejected, that no one cared, that he was completely alone. But these people had come, had risked their own safety to protect him and Clara, had shown he wasn't alone, never was. Sheriff Sullivan arrived half an hour later with 2 deputies, heard everyone's reports, noted everything on official paper, and left in pursuit of Darrell. Found the 3 on the road, still drunk, still armed. They were arrested red-handed for trespassing, threats, attempted violence. The sheriff returned at dawn to inform Richard and Clara. "They'll be held for a few days, then answer in court. With 4 respectable witnesses, including a priest and known merchant, no way they escape punishment. And I'll make it clear to Darrell that if he bothers you again, it'll be much worse." Think he'll get the message this time? When the sheriff left, when Widow Higgins, Father August, and Mr. Oakley finally departed after many thanks and emotional hugs, Richard and Clara stood alone in the yard as dawn began to paint the sky pink and gold. They sat on the porch steps, exhausted but relieved, hands entwined. "It's over," whispered Clara. "Is it really over?" Richard squeezed her hand. "I think so. He won't risk coming back after being arrested, having witnesses against him. And even if he tries, we aren't alone anymore. There are people who care, people who will protect us." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "I never had that before. People protecting me, people standing by my side. It was always just me, alone, trying to survive." Richard kissed the top of her head. "You're not alone anymore. You have me. You have the community. You have a real home." Clara lifted her face, looked at him in the soft dawn light. You changed my life, Richard. Saved it. He shook his head. We saved each other. You gave me a reason to live again. Gave me courage to face the world. Made me feel I was worth something. Without you, I'd still be hiding in that house, waiting for life to pass. You brought me back to the world. They stayed there until the sun rose completely, illuminating the plains with intense gold, birds starting their morning song, the smell of dew and wet earth rising from the crops. It was a new day, new beginning. And for the first time in many years, both Richard and Clara believed better days were truly possible. The months that followed were of profound transformation. Darrell was tried and sentenced to 6 months in jail for trespassing and threats. When he got out, he went back to Silverton and never bothered Clara again. News of the trial spread through the region, and the story of Richard, the scarred farmer who faced invaders to protect his wife, became known. People's perception began to change. He wasn't just the scarred man everyone avoided anymore. He was Richard Albright, hard-working farmer, man of courage, devoted husband. Richard started going to town more frequently, not just once a month, but every week. Talked to people, attended Sunday Mass beside Clara, bought and sold produce, was part of the community. Some still looked away from his scars, but many didn't. Many greeted with genuine respect, asked about the farm, about Clara, included him in conversations. Widow Higgins visited every week, always bringing something and staying for lunch, telling stories that made Clara laugh and Richard smile. Father August appeared once a month to bless the house and have coffee. Mr. Oakley always set aside the best goods for Richard when he went to the market, refusing to charge extra. Clara blossomed too. The thin, pale woman who arrived with a bundle tied in string gained weight, gained color in her cheeks, gained life in her eyes. She learned to work the land beside Richard, planting together, harvesting together, building something bigger than both. She discovered she had talent for crafts, started making embroidery and selling it in town. Earning her own money she kept in a clay pot with pride. Started smiling more, laughing openly, singing while cooking. Started calling that house home without hesitation. Their marriage, which started as a transaction of convenience, transformed into true partnership and deep love. They worked side by side during the day, cooked together at night, slept embraced in the same bed every night. Talked about everything, plans to expand the planting, animals, childhood memories, dreams for the future. Richard told stories about his lost children, and Clara listened, holding his hand, letting him process the pain he kept alone for so long. Clara spoke about the difficult years of bad marriage, the constant fear, and Richard held her while she cried, promising she would never have to feel fear like that again. They had their own rituals. Every Sunday morning, woke up early and drank coffee in the yard watching the sunrise. Every Friday night after dinner, sat on the porch and Richard smoked while Clara embroidered, the two in companionable silence. Every time one went to town, brought something small for the other, a different fruit, a piece of candy, a spool of colored thread, a new straw cigarette, small demonstrations of love that said, "I thought of you. You matter." 2 years passed. The farm prospered even more under their joint management. Bought more land, increased the herd, built a new corral and a smokehouse. Richard, with Clara's help, renovated the main house, adding another room and a larger porch. Painted the walls light blue, planted flowers in the garden, put curtains on the windows. The house stopped being just functional and became beautiful, became a reflection of the love growing inside it. In the 3rd year of marriage, on a May morning, Clara woke up feeling sick. Vomited, felt dizzy, and Richard was desperate, thinking she was ill. Took her to town to consult Mrs. Amelia, the midwife who also cared for the sick. The old midwife examined Clara, asked questions, and then smiled with that smile that knew secrets. "It's not illness, my child. You are expecting a baby. About 3 months, I'd say." Clara was in shock, hands automatically going to her still flat belly. Richard, waiting outside, entered when Mrs. Amelia called and heard the news. His face went through 1,000 expressions in seconds: surprise, fear, joy, terror, hope. "A child," he repeated, voice trembling. "We're going to have a child." Clara looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Do you want it? Are you happy?" Richard knelt in front of her, took her hands in his, and answered with a choked voice, "I'm too happy, scared but happy. You will be a wonderful mother, and I'll try to be a good father, better than I was last time." The pregnancy was smooth. Clara continued working, but Richard didn't let her do anything heavy, taking on extra tasks with gusto. He built a wooden cradle, working on it at night by lantern light, carving delicate details, sanding until it was soft as silk. Clara sewed tiny clothes, embroidering flowers and birds on the hems, singing softly while working. They chose names together. If a boy, John, in honor of the son Richard lost. If a girl, Laurie, Clara's mother's name. The baby was born in January 1907 on a hot summer afternoon. It was a difficult birth, long, but Clara was strong. Mrs. Amelia handled everything, and when she finally placed the baby in Clara's arms, it was a girl. Small, red, screaming with impressive strength. Laurie. Richard, waiting in the living room, pacing back and forth, almost broke the door down when Mrs. Amelia called him. Entered the room slowly, afraid of breaking something, and stopped upon seeing Clara in bed, holding the small bundle. She smiled despite the exhaustion, face lit with joy. "Come meet your daughter." Richard approached, trembling, looked at the little child in Clara's lap, and felt something immense explode in his chest. It was love, but different love from what he felt for Clara. It was protective, absolute, fierce love. "She's perfect," he whispered, voice choked. "She's so small." "So perfect." Clara took his hand, placed it over the baby's little body. "She's ours, Richard, our family." He nodded, tears flowing freely down his marked face. A new family, a new chance. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had stayed when all fled, who had seen value in him when the world only saw monstrosity. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for staying, for loving me, for giving me this." Clara held his marked face with her free hand. "You don't have to thank. You gave me everything too. Gave me a home, gave me love, gave me reason to wake up every day with hope. We saved each other, Richard, and now we'll raise her together in this love we built." They kissed there with their daughter between them, and it was a perfect moment. Moment of complete healing. Moment where painful past finally gave way to brilliant future. Years passed like river water, constant and inevitable. Laurie grew strong and healthy, a girl with brown hair and dark eyes like her mother, but with her father's smile. At 3, she had no fear of Richard's scars. Climbed on him like a tree, traced the irregular contours of the marked skin with small, curious fingers, and said Daddy had a hero's face, because only heroes had battle marks. Richard melted every time she said that, picked the girl up and spun until she laughed, that crystal laugh of a happy child filling the house with light. 2 years later, a boy was born, John, as planned, and then another girl, whom they named Rose. The house that was once silent and empty now overflowed with life. Children's voices, laughter, crying, games, organized mess of a big family. Richard, who thought he'd never have children again, never have family again, now had 3. And Clara, who lived in fear and loneliness for so long, now lived surrounded by love. The farm continued to prosper. Richard, with help from 2 hired hands, expanded production even more, sold corn, beans, pumpkins to neighboring towns, created a reputation as reliable and honest suppliers. Clara opened a small embroidery business that grew so much other women in the region started working with her, creating an informal cooperative. Money wasn't abundant, but it was enough. More than enough. They had plenty on the table, clean clothes in the closet, solid roof overhead, and love in their hearts. They had everything that mattered. In 1915, 8 years after Laurie's birth, Richard turned 52. He was sitting on the porch on an October afternoon, smoking and watching the children play in the yard. Laurie, now 8, taught 6-year-old John and 4-year-old Rose to make kites with sticks and paper. Clara was in the kitchen preparing dinner, singing softly, and the smell of good food wafted through the house. Widow Higgins, now 77 and slower but still lively, was sitting next to Richard, drinking coffee and commenting on town news. "It's impressive how everything changed," said the old lady with a contemplative voice. "Remember when you lived here alone, Richard? When you thought you'd die alone too?" Richard nodded slowly, eyes still on the children. "Remember well. Seems like another life." Widow Higgins smiled. "It is another life. You transformed, stopped being that hidden man and became this man here. Family man, respected farmer, active community member. You're an example to many people, you know. Example that scars don't define character. That appearance doesn't define worth." Richard thought about that, about the whole journey, since that day he asked Father August to help him find a wife, about the 3 women who fled, about Clara who stayed, about the love that grew between them, about the family they built, about the life they now had. "I got lucky," he said finally. "Lucky she stayed." Widow Higgins shook her head. "Wasn't luck, Richard. Was destiny. You two needed each other. She needed someone to protect and love her for real. You needed someone to see you for real. It was perfect." Clara came out of the house calling everyone for dinner. The children ran, laughing and pushing each other. Richard stood up, helped Widow Higgins up too, and they went inside. The table was full: rice, beans, chicken stew, garden salad, fresh bread, apple juice. Everyone sat down, said the prayer of thanks Richard led every night, and began to eat. Conversation flowed naturally, Laurie telling about school in town, John showing the pretty rock he found in the pasture, Rose asking for more bread with that small child persistence. Clara and Richard looked at each other across the table, exchanging knowing smiles of parents who know the happy mess of having children. After dinner, after Widow Higgins left, promising to return next week, after the children were put to bed with stories and good-night kisses, Richard and Clara sat on the porch as they did every night. The moon was full, illuminating the plains with silver, and crickets sang their night symphony. Richard smoked, Clara embroidered, but after a while she put down the embroidery and just held his hand. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Richard turned his face to look at her, at that woman who completely transformed his existence. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," he answered with absolute sincerity. "You?" Clara smiled, that smile that still made him feel 10 years younger. "Completely happy. Every day I wake up and give thanks for having the courage to come, for staying, for choosing you." Richard squeezed her hand. "I thank you. You saved me, Clara, pulled me out of the darkness, gave me light, gave me life." They stayed there on the porch until late, just holding hands, sharing comfortable silence that only truly connected couples can share. Inside the house, the children slept safe. Around, the prosperous farm stretched out. Above, stars shone eternal. And there, on that porch, 2 hearts marked by life beat in the same rhythm, united by the most unlikely and truest love. The love that was born when everyone fled but one stayed, and by staying, changed everything. Richard Albright had asked for a wife at 40. 3 women fled upon seeing his scars, but one stayed, and the one who stayed not only gave him love and family, gave him back his own humanity. Proved that a man's worth is not in the perfection of his face, but in the strength of his character. And together, 2 survivors of different tragedies built something beautiful and lasting, built a home, built love, built a legacy that would continue through their children and their children's children, through generations to come, carrying the story that true love sees beyond the surface and finds beauty where others only see flaws. And when Richard died many years later in 1928, at 65 of natural causes, sleeping peacefully with Clara by his side, he was buried in the town cemetery with honors of a respected man. Half the community attended the funeral. Father August, old but still lucid, conducted the ceremony and spoke about the brave man who faced his demons and won, about the hard-working farmer who helped build the community, about the devoted father who raised good children, about the faithful husband who loved only one woman until his last breath. The scars that once defined him in the eyes of the world were not mentioned, because they didn't matter anymore, never really mattered. What mattered was inscribed in the hearts of all who knew him truly. Richard Albright was a good man who lived a good life because he found true love. And true love transforms everything.